Hi there, my name is Ben Cunliffe, and today we're going to be looking at a critical evaluation of endurance training with low carbohydrates. Firstly, the aim of this video will be to explore some endurance adaptations, how low carbohydrate training affects untrained athletes, then progress this to see whether it affects trained athletes, and finally look at some long-term progressions and conclude. For many years now, carbohydrates have been explained to be the key macronutrient for both endurance training and performance, as explained by Cochrane et al. And therefore many athletes have been increasingly encouraged to consume a highly dominant carbohydrate diet, leading to certain techniques being employed before competitions such as carbo loading. Is this the best strategy for both training and performance, or will these manipulations just aid skeletal adaptations as suggested by Hawley and Morton in 2014, and have no overall performance effect? Carbohydrates are used to replenish the body's stores of glycogen and hence are used as a fuel to perform at a more comfortable level and has always been suggested to contribute to longer endurance performance. When training for endurance adaptations events, we can observe both intracellular and physical adaptations. Firstly, intracellular adaptations, which include mitochondrial biogenesis. This process is initiated by the activation of PGC1 alpha, which co-activates mitochondrial transcription factors. This adaptation can be identified through a larger production of mitochondrial enzymes, most important citrate synthase. Augmenting the size of mitochondria and hence increasing mitochondrial enzyme production should increase the effectiveness of synthesizing ATP and other useful adaptations for endurance events. With a more efficient endurance system, will this increase performance? When it comes to physical adaptations, we will observe an increase in type 2A fibers and also angiogenesis. The first trial we will explore is by Hansen et al. In 2004. They used a within-subject design with 7 healthy untrained males. The objective of this trial was to explore the skeletal muscle adaptations which come from training, with access to low muscle glycogen. The training type enforced was knee extensions at 75% power max for an hour each session. One leg trained twice every other day with a second session commencing 2 hours after the first. This format was used to create a reduction in the resting muscle glycogen levels so performance commenced in a low carbohydrate state. The other leg performed this exercise every day for a single hour. The duration of the trial was 10 weeks. Due to the length of the trial, we need to think how long these improvements were made just by circumstances alone. The reason for questioning this is that the familiarization effect for the movement will be induced once the performer learns how the movement can be performed best or easiest. This will initiate an increase in adaptations, although we could observe this in both groups. Furthermore, Hansen didn't account for a favourability in legs, which can be apparent with a more dominant side. Additionally, a key observation in this study will be that the time to exhaustion increased significantly in both groups, but was more pronounced in the low leg group, where it was approximately 2 times as long. This fact alone could suggest a better performance, but due to testing being set at a fixed intensity and was non-performance related, we cannot assume that this interpreted better performance. Alternatively, if a time trial had been included in the trial design, we could observe this more closely and maybe provide better conclusions. When carbohydrate-adapted athletes run out their endogenous carbohydrate reserves during endurance activities, they have to become dependent on exogenous carbohydrates. Alternatively, low-carb athletes can rely on their fat reserves in their body for an instantaneous energy source. Generally, the carbohydrate stores run out after approximately 3 hours of submaximal work, so this comment could be more important to ultra-distance runners studied by Volek. Burke and Hawley suggested this. In low leg group, there was also significant changes in resting muscle glycogen in comparison to the high group. Even though when training, this group was subject to less than optimal amounts of muscle glycogen, it has been suggested that untrained athletes through endurance training, there are an improvement in resting muscle glycogen for about 20 to 30%. So we need to explore this further, whether this was the case of the adaptation or not just the training conditions. Finally, mitochondrial enzyme activity was significantly increased for citrate synthase in both low leg and high leg conditions. From pre-training to 10 weeks, this was more pronounced in the low leg group. Also, HAD, mitochondrial enzyme, another mitochondrial enzyme, is used to break down fatty acids, was significantly increased, which can explain a higher rate of fat oxidation during performance. To develop on the training adaptations observed in the previous paper, Yu et al. Proposed a similar experimental model in observing changes in the skeletal muscle adaptations. The training model in this paper was based around a between-subjects design, which was the first difference. Additionally, the participants in the trial were already endurance-trained athletes, so this allowed us to explore whether the protocol affect both trained and untrained athletes. There were 18 participants in the Yu et al. Trial, with 14 participating in the chronic study and 12 in the acute study. 8 of these participants participated in the chronic study too. The chronic study participants were split into low and high groups with 7 active participants in each, and the acute study involved a single training session to measure the adaptations after one bout of the methodology. Overall, these methods in reducing glycogen stores used during exercise were the same, but different types of exercise. Aerobic training was performed at approximately 70% of VO2 peak for 100 minutes one day, then alternating to high intensity training at maximal effort the next day for the high group. The low leg group then performed these exercises every second day but with an hour break in between the two conditions, meaning HIIT training was performed at a limited muscle glycogen state. In comparison to the Hansen paper, these exercises were more suited to participants as trained cyclists, hence these measures were targeted closely to their warm-up techniques. Although they were more familiarised with the activities, this could show better adaptations in relation to a sporting situation. The familiarisation effect wasn't accounted for in the Hansen trial. This impact on results may have been counteracted by the length of the study proposed by Yeo of 3 weeks, alternative to the 10-week design by Hansen. Additionally, by alternating the types of training being undertaken, we can assume Yeo has attempted to reduce this effect. Secondly, we observe in this trial that resting muscle glycogen is significantly increased in the low muscle glycogen protocol in comparison to the high muscle glycogen condition. This suggests that where Yeo et al. Explained that 20 to 30% of the increase in muscle glycogen was due to the participants being untrained individuals may be incorrect, as this effect wouldn't have been present for the endurance-trained athletes, yet a similar response was witnessed, telling that there was another mechanism present. Finally, this study agreed with Hansen et al. That mitochondrial enzyme activity and production increased. Citrate synthase again was significant in both groups, with a high activity rate in the low group. There was no difference in HAD in the high group, whereas the low group again showed a significant difference. Overall, the findings in this paper coincide with Hansen et al., but more importantly, we can show that even endurance and trained athletes, when they switch to a training regime which results in low muscle glycogen concentration and a similar metabolic enzyme increase, there are clear skeletal adaptations present. Whether these adaptations affect performance, we are yet to observe a study which proves that. Considering that a lack of sport-specific performance measures to observe the effects in the change of endurance adaptations from these low glycogen states, we can observe some long-term effects or outcomes in ultra-distance athletes and the impact of diets on their bodies. Volek et al. Looked at a group of 20 athletes who had specific high carbohydrate or high fat diets which had been consumed for 9 to 36 months, and how in turn they optimised the use of substrates within their body. There were 2 testing days, one which measured the optimisation of fat from a maximal oxygen consumption test, and the second a 64% maximal oxygen run, which to establish how metabolic effects occur before, during and after exercise. Even though an intervention wasn't introduced during the study, the participants were required to consume a low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate shake before and after exercise. Hansen et al. Suggest that when performing under low muscle glycogen conditions, that catecholamine, a marker for stress for metabolic or physical, was increased. This would suggest a high perceived rate of exertion if measured, although with the participants performing on the low carbohydrate diets, they showed a similar progression for RPE, which was not significantly different between the groups. This can show that when athletes fully adapt to a ketogenic diet, they will not be hindered during performance. We still observe the differences in the low carb and high carb groups having a difference with peak fat oxidation rates. The low carb group oxidized 2.3 times more. Likewise, with the low carb group accessing carbohydrates at a higher rate than the low carb group, who utilise it at a lower level. The experiment showed resynthesis of muscle glycogen had no difference between groups, considering that low carbohydrate groups oxidise a lot less carbohydrates during exercise. In addition, muscle glycogen resynthesis has been said to increase after exercise when large amounts of carbohydrates are consumed, which would be explained by the high carbohydrate group, who utilise the carbohydrates from the shake. This wasn't provided for the low carbohydrate group, so what triggered the synthesis? It is possible that synthesis occurred from hepatic gluconeogenesis or from lactate being transported across cell membranes, but with the body in chronic ketogenesis, Shimazu et al. Suggests that this causes a reduction in HDAC in mice, which in turn reduces the production of ROS and oxidative stress. Could this allow for better recovery or potentially show similarities to homeostasis? An increase in recovery can be subsequently be backed up by Podgler and Dubovec in 2016, who placed a low-carb adapted athletes on a 14-day high-carbohydrate diet. This showed a difference of 5 millimole after exercise of lactate after exercise compared with a low-carbohydrate group, and still showed a 2 millimole difference at 5 minutes after exercise, hence suggesting that recovery rates are accentuated with a low-carbohydrate diet. This type of study is still quite new, and we have to consider that the trial was only completed on 1 participant. Subsequently, low-carb diets have been shown to improve recovery. To conclude, it has been shown that adaptations of a low-carbohydrate diet or training protocol significantly increases certain endurance adaptations, which suggests an increase in performance. We have identified that there have been limited amounts of performance studies to date, and therefore it's not possible to recommend this as a performance-enhancing technique. Although dietary change has not been shown to limit endurance-based performance, as identified by Hansen and many other clinicians, showing that time to exhaustion etc. was increased. The progression of this video has been used to outline very similar adaptations with methods put in place, but this has been outlined across both untrained and trained athletes to show that the primary observations weren't just the cause of subsequently new training induced. Alternatively, we can conclude that the protocols explored have been shown to increase utilisation of endogenous substrates which are clearly accessible faster than becoming reliant on gels and carbo loading. This has transcended into further adaptations which allow for fast recovery rates in muscle glycogen, removal rates of lactate from the body, which are all beneficial adaptations. Subsequently, it is a key progression for research to observe that if there are any strictly performance-related benefits, otherwise we conclude there haven't been large implications physically on endurance capabilities if the body is given long enough to fully adapt to ketogenesis.